What are intermediaries and scope and credentials? This is such an important concept within the PensionSync platform. Intermediaries, credentials and scope govern so much of the security model inside the platform that helps make sure that we don't send data to the wrong destination for the wrong employer. So it's a really, really important concept. Inside PensionSync, we have the concept of an intermediary. In actual fact, an intermediary represents the user of your payroll software. So this could be, for example, a company, a bureau, or an accountancy, or it potentially could be an individual employer. But it's a unique identifier that we give to you via our API that uniquely identifies the user of your software. That's an intermediary. Now, intermediaries have certain attributes, and we call these attributes scope. And scope defines what the intermediary can or cannot do with the data. Very, very simply put, a scope entity is a tuple. It's a tuple with, which starts with the destination ID of the pension provider. So let's say LGS, representing legal and general, or TPP, representing the people's pension, and the employer ID. And the employer ID is the identifier that the pension provider has given for that particular scheme. And that tuple, people's pension and their employer ID, represents a scope entity which is associated with the intermediary ID. And that means that PensionSync understands that it is right and proper for that intermediary ID to be able to send data to that destination on behalf of that employer. Very, very secure, robust model. The other entity is the credentials entity. The credentials entity is associated with scope, because when you send data in an automated way to a pension provider, the pension provider typically asks for authorization to make sure that whoever's sending the data has the rights to send the data. And typically that authorization manifests itself as either a username or a password, or through an OAuth 2 authentication process, a three-legged authentication process. Either way, PensionSync has the ability to permanently store those credentials inside its platform. So we don't always have to throw up a dialog box and say, hey, give us the username and password, or go through an OAuth authentication process for this provider. So we have an intermediary, we have scope, and then each scope may have a credentials entity associated with it. Some pension providers, legal and general is a good example of this, don't require credentials because PensionSync has a very unique and highly sophisticated way of managing credentials with legal and general. But typically, most pension providers will ask for credentials, and you have to create this logical construct. Intermediaries, scope has credentials objects. So let's draw a diagram to make this simpler to understand. Let's say that this circle here is an intermediary inside PensionSync, and it has a number of scope entities hanging off it. So each one of these legs coming off the intermediary ID represents scope, the tuple between the employer ID and the destination, the pension provider. And off there, we will have credentials associated with the scope. So there's a credentials object, maybe that's username and password, maybe that's an OAuth 2 token over here, another one. And over here, this one, let's say that doesn't have any credentials established with it. So you have an intermediary ID, then you have scope, and then you associate credentials with the scope. It's a pretty simple setup once you understand it, and it's fundamental to the internal operations of PensionSync.